Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. We're going to give it a couple of minutes just to make sure we get everyone who plans on joining. But yeah, good morning if you're on the eastern seaboard of the US, and good afternoon, good evening if you're joining from other parts of the world. We're really glad to have you here. Thanks for hanging out with us. We'll be getting this session started very soon, just giving it another minute. Right. We will start soon. Thanks for joining. If you've just logged in, we're just waiting another minute and then we'll get started. All right. It's 9:02, at least here in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So I think we'll get started. Thank you so much to everyone who has joined. We are very glad to have you here. Yeah, I hope you're at the right session. This is Bridging Business Growth, Community Involvement, and Women's Empowerment. And we have quite the action-packed session here for you today. So I will quickly just set the agenda. We're going to do a couple of minutes of housekeeping. I'll do an introduction of our speakers, and then we'll get right into it. So in terms of housekeeping, please share in the chat if you'd like who you are, where you're calling in from, and yes, please drop in your LinkedIn if you'd like to connect with us. My colleague Heather Esper has already got us started. And if you have questions, please add them in any time. There's a Q&A tab at the bottom. So if you could put the questions over there, that'll be great. If you put them in the chat, sometimes what happens is we miss them. So do put them in the Q&A tab if possible. And with that, let's get started. I'm so glad to be here. My name is Yaquta Fatehi. I work at the William Davidson Institute here at the University of Michigan. And I work on the performance measurement and impact team. And so, yes, qualitative and quantitative research is our daily bread and butter. And we've been working in the gender space from 2013 onwards, from some of our earliest projects. And so, very much interested in this topic about how to apply a measurement lens at this nexus of business, community involvement, and women's empowerment. And so what we'll do today is, we'll introduce the speakers and then we'll set the stage and then we'll get into some really nice meaty questions. And so please add your questions in the Q&A tab at any time. So today I'm really, really excited to join. Carmen is joining us from Pro Mujer, and Kaitlin is joining us from CARE. I'm a big fangirl of Carmen. If you've heard Carmen speak before, you'll know why. But she, as a senior leader, she's the CEO of Pro Mujer. As a senior leader, she is one of the most approachable people I've ever met. So big fangirl. Really glad to be sharing the stage with her today. Let me give a little bit of a formal introduction. So with 30 years of experience in the development sector, Carmen has served as Pro Mujer CEO since 2022, driving the organization's mission to create opportunities for women across Latin America. A career devoted to innovation and impact, she has extensive experience in operations and strategy. Pro Mujer is a social enterprise that has been working to advance gender equality in Latin America for more than 35 years. They provide services and tools in 3 areas: health and well-being, financial inclusion, and skilling. And of course, they are women-centric, and as you can see, women-led. Kaitlin Love is a fellow SEPA alum like me, and we met at a Business Fights Poverty table in New York, just sitting next to each other, totally geeking out about social research, about the ethics, about how do we make data collection more participatory, and really think about who owns the data and how they should get the first digs and how they're using it, how they're advocating for themselves, etc. So I'm so excited that she's here on this call as well. Let me give a formal introduction to her. Kaitlin Love is the Global Sustainability Principal at CARE. She specializes in understanding and cultivating impact by using research to drive improved outcomes for people and organizations across the public and private sector and around the globe. CARE, I don't think there's much introduction needed to CARE, but CARE is an international NGO where women form a vital part of CARE's community-based efforts to improve basic education, increase access to quality healthcare, and expand economic opportunity for all. So let's get this started. We'll have some opening thoughts both from Carmen as well as Kaitlin, and then I'll share a few thoughts as well. And then we'll go into some really nice questions, and of course open it up to questions from you guys as well. So please do introduce yourself in the chat function. Please engage with one another, engage with us, and then on the Q&A is where you put your questions. And for anything else, just a huge thank you to Glocal for this platform. We've had 4 sessions so far this week, and we were just laughing internally that I don't think we could have had a 5th because we've maxed out. But we will be sending the recordings of all the 4 sessions to everyone that registered today. We talked about just transitions. My colleague Heather Esper, who's on the chat, talked about systems tools, and one of them is rich context mapping, if that's something of interest to you. And then, of course, this is us talking about business, engaging with community, and then, of course, focusing on women's advancement and using a measurement lens. So with that, my first question to you is to you, Carmen. How does gender analysis feature in Pro Mujer's mission?
Thank you. Thank you very much for that question. Thank you very much, Yaquta, for this introduction and for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here this morning. And basically answering to your question, at Pro Mujer, we have been working for over 3 decades to advance gender equality in Latin America. So we know that impact measurement is not just a tool, but really a necessity to create real and sustainable change. And partners, for example, such as Visa Foundation, push us and help us to understand and improve the way we measure our impact. Measuring allows us to basically quantify the impact of our interventions, but more importantly, it helps us to understand the real impact of our work on the quality of life of women. It's how we really understand if we are making a real change. So without data, without evidence, we wouldn't be able to evaluate the effectiveness of our initiatives or even adjust our strategies when something isn't working as expected. So moreover, we have been clear and well-defined, and basically metrics, it's a key way of attracting investors, of even reaching more donors and strategic partners. And it allows us to demonstrate the value of our model, the value of our work, and ultimately measurement allows us to evolve, to keep improving, to innovate, and obviously to ensure that our actions are truly responding to the real needs of the women we serve. Without that, we won't be able to really get to know if our work is generating a real and sustainable impact.
Thank you so much, Carmen. And I love your response because, you've talked about, of course, it's about impact measurement, and of course, it's about adaptive management, about enabling innovation. But I think the one thing that you highlighted that's really important is that it's actually a way to attract new partners as well, right? New investors, funders, strategic partners. It's a lever, right? It's more than just strategy and budgeting. It's actually also building community and building new partnerships. So with that, I'd love to turn it over to you, Kaitlin, just to hear your initial thoughts on how does data feature in your work with supply chains and in the larger organization?
For sure. Thank you so much. And thanks for having me here. Because of my background, which is entirely in social impact measurement, when I came to CARE, it was always going to involve data, right? But I think that there's some things going on at the macro level that have really increased the importance of data. So within CARE, I sit on the CARE Impact Partners team. We're kind of like a consulting arm of CARE that builds strategic partnerships with our corporate partners. So moving a little from the CSR philanthropic paradigm, right, to trying to develop partnerships that embed CARE's work in the business from like a sustainability and a social impact perspective, which is great. Like we love that, right? But an increasing part of that is really data for a couple reasons. The first one is the kind of EU sustainability legislation, other places that require companies to report on both their negative and positive impacts, right? And I think because of that environment, at least on our side, what we're seeing is a lot more corporates are requiring a lot more, what's the right word? Well, they're technically doing auditing and assurance of their social impact data, which is an entirely different kind of world that is forming as we speak, right? Because auditing social impact data is totally different than auditing financial data. And how that impacts us is it kind of shifts the data that we're delivering to corporate partners, whereas like CARE as a development and humanitarian organization produces data as like an accountability mechanism, right? Like this is how we use the money that you provided to us. And now data is becoming almost like a deliverable back to the companies, the same way that like impact is becoming a deliverable to them. And we're not, I think a lot of NGOs actually aren't quite set up to deliver the type of data that businesses need. And so a really big part of my role is figuring out how do we shift our internal practices to make it so that what we're delivering to corporates is the data and is the impact that they need to be able to embed our work in their business and therefore like guarantee kind of CARE's longevity, right? So yeah, that was kind of a long answer, but it's a super interesting time to be in this work.
Yeah. And I loved how you brought in this focus on regulation, right? And social impact auditing. And I know we'll talk a little bit later on about this as well. I think in my opening, we heard what is the purpose of data, how there is a difference between NGOs and corporates. And then I want to take the direction of a little bit of sharing about tools that we've used around data in this space specifically, right? So the space is actually the nexus of business, community engagement, and women advancement. And so I'm going to give 3 examples, and I'll go into a little bit of detail to give some nitty-gritty details on the tools, and then we'll again zoom back out a little bit. So the 3 examples is the first one is actually a social enterprise in Mexico City. The technique we used was actually a combination of qualitative and quantitative research, but it was about the sequencing as well as the parallel use of qualitative and quantitative research. And that's what mixed methods really is, right? It's about the strategic use of qualitative and quantitative research. So what we did was we first actually started with qualitative interviews with the women who were serving as last mile distributors for Danone. We then did a survey where we, of course, asked some open-ended questions as well. And that survey was developed based on what we had learned from the initial qualitative interviews. And then we did a new round of qualitative interviews. And I understand that you need resources to do this, but the new round of qualitative interviews post-survey analysis was to understand, why is this change happening? How is this change happening? What more can the company do to improve, right? So thinking about the techniques that you use, and mixed methods is not just, okay, we'll give a survey with a few open-ended questions, but really thinking through about how do we strategically use both qualitative and quantitative research. Another piece on the Danone project was actually about using social impacts along with financial metrics, and actually doing statistical correlations between social impacts like self-efficacy and financial impacts like sales and turnovers, especially at last mile distribution models. Sales is, of course, the key metric of success, but turnover is such a massive issue. And so what we did was we tried to better understand, is there a correlation between life skills training and skills development with actually improving sales and reducing turnover. And we did find that correlation. So that's one example. In the second example around G-Search, we worked with 21 companies over there, and we could only create case studies for 5, again, because of resources. So we found that case studies is a great tool because we actually can do some of that primary data collection ourselves, and we have a little bit control around what questions we want to ask in our surveys. And we always ask, irrespective of what the research is focusing on, is including a few adaptive management questions. How can this program be improved? What are the challenges that you're still facing, right? Whether it's with a company like Nova Coffee in Rwanda that is working with their coffee farmers who are women to adapt to climate change, asking them, or it's another company like the one in Bangladesh where they were doing training for their women middle managers. So in both cases, we added questions around adaptive management. And then the other thing I wanted to share about is when you don't have resources to do those types of in-depth case studies, right? What we did was, with the remaining 21 minus 5 companies, is we actually did qualitative interviews with the staff, but also with the implementing partner, right? And also with the investor, to kind of try and paint a complete picture by looking at who are the various stakeholders, what data do they have already available, and can we leverage any of that existing data so we reduce the burden on companies, on their employees, on their customers, whoever you're collecting the data from. And then the third example that I want to go into is actually return on investment calculations of women inclusive models, of community engagement models. And we did this work with a company in both East Africa, in both of the companies were in East Africa, so one in Uganda and one in Ethiopia, where we looked at, all right, this was your original model, what are the revenues and costs around that? And this is your new model that is women-centric. One was a last mile distribution model, again, for clean cook stoves, and the other one was actually putting a daycare on the factory floor. And we looked at that ROI calculation to see, is there a positive ROI? And there are some pros and cons of that method, but I think the benefits of that was really calculating the ROI was equally valuable for the companies, right? So of course, as researchers, we're giving them a number, and that is very valuable to them because then they can take them to their investors, that like Carmen mentioned, to potential investors, to potential partners. But through that exercise, they actually looked at that data management systems, and they realized what's missing and where can technology play a role in helping them with data management. And also there was incredible amount of learning around contribution analysis, around theories of change, around identifying the right proxy financial indicators, because that's what you need for an ROI calculation. This was not an SROI. It was a purely financial ROI. So I just wanted to take you guys through some of the tools and techniques, because we started big and we're trying to funnel down. And so with that, there are, of course, lots of other examples, and Heather's going to drop in some links in the chat, so watch out for that. But I want to now, again, turn back to Carmen. So let's stay a little narrow, Carmen. What are the current tools and techniques to design and measure women empowerment outcomes, and also for Pro Mujer, who is active in this gender lens investing sector? And how do you integrate it with your operations, with your strategy, organizational functioning? Yeah.
Well, basically at Pro Mujer, we have learned that measuring impact is not just about tracking progress. And I think with these examples you should share, basically that is it. It's about basically driving meaningful change. So the earlier organizations build this mindset, the stronger and more sustainable their impact will be. We cannot start implementing a project or an initiative, and when we are up to the end, almost start thinking on, oh, how should I be measuring this? Or how basically, which are the KPIs? No, you have to think very well in advance. You have to think on those before you start any type of implementation. So in that sense, I always like to talk about a few points, I would say like 7, 6 key points that we consider essential to design and basically to measure women empowerment outcomes, and that we are applying day after day in our work. The first one, I think, is we have to define a clear objective. We have to be clear on what we want to achieve. Before even designing, measuring how we are going to be measuring impact, we have to be clear about what we want to achieve with that initiative, with that project, with the program we are going to put in place. So align basically your impact goals with a broader mission and identify the key indicators that will allow you to track progress, because otherwise it won't work. So you have to be clear on that specific objective you want to achieve. The second one, it's basically, as you were sharing with the Mexican example, prioritize both qualitative and quantitative data, because numbers matter, of course, but also do stories. Combining the metrics, the numbers with real life testimonials gives a fuller picture, a complete picture of the impact you are generating. And it helps people to be engaged. It helps to engage different stakeholders more effectively. So you will be able to understand, okay, they of course, they are impacting, I don't know, a certain amount of women. Those women are improving their sales. Those women are improving their quality of life. But how? And if you get to know the stories behind those numbers, it really engages everybody to actually be working with you, understanding your work, understanding the impact you are generating. The third one will be leverage existing frameworks. We have to use, there are many frameworks out there. There are many established methodologies to measure impact, such as, for example, 2X challenge criteria that can help you structure the impact measurement in a way that it's both, in one sense, credible, because you are actually measuring through a methodology that is in place. And the second one is comparable. You can compare yourself with others that are using the same methodologies. The fourth one will be engage the community you serve. And I think that is key. We are out there. We know the women we serve. The best way to measure impact is by listening to those directly affected, to those that are receiving your services, that are basically with whom you are working. They have to co-create the impact strategy, and they have to be, those beneficiaries are the ones that will allow you to understand how you better can measure, and it will ensure the relevance and the long-term effectiveness of whatever program you want to put in place. I think the fifth one will be use few KPIs. There is a tendency when you want to measure, you start, oh, okay, as I will be out there measuring the impact, I want to incorporate more and more things that I can measure. The thing is that you have to prioritize quality versus quantity. It will be impossible to track hundreds of KPIs. Select just a few powerful KPIs that can show your real impact and that can rapidly secure how you can automate the tracking, because otherwise it won't work. It will be impossible. Then the sixth one, it will be like seek help. There are many well-known organizations, very professional organizations that can really support you. It's impossible. We are not experts. It's impossible to really understand everything. We have to understand actually our limitations, and we have to recognize when it is time to request for help. There are highly respected organizations out there providing incredible support, such as 60 Decibel, Siglas, and many others. Look for them because they can really help and support in that measurement. And obviously, and I think the last one and an obvious one is, don't just measure impact to fulfill the request from a donor or from an investor. Really use it on your benefit, use it in your advantage, use it to take decisions, to actually adjust your programs, to innovate, to keep growing. But don't just use measurement just to put a check on that box with an investor or a donor.
Yeah, I absolutely love that blueprint that you laid out, Carmen. I think a lot of really critical points you raised. And in fact, one of my earliest projects, which actually formed the first principles that I use, we absolutely co-designed. In fact, we integrated measurement with the program team, with the design and implementation team. And this was the large Women in Water project that was run by USAID and GAP back in the day. So with that, I want to turn it over to Kaitlin to hear what her blueprint is. So what are the tools and techniques used to design and measure supply chain resilience? Keeping in mind, Kaitlin, you did talk about, actually, we also have to meet regulatory requirements, right? So we'd love to hear that added pressure. How does that affect you?
For sure. Thank you so much. I think, generally speaking, the field of measurement when it comes to supply chain resilience, or SROI, is very nascent, right? It hasn't been a terribly long time that companies have been thinking about building resilience through their work with communities or through their work with women, and really wanting like measurement on the impact of that. That being said, where CARE tends to focus is on the components of resilience that we're trying to improve, right? So to take like a somewhat overused example, we work quite a lot in cocoa, and improving farmer livelihoods more generally across agricultural supply chains, I think, is one of the areas where this work has progressed the most because of some of the urgency with which we need people to farm the things that we want to consume, right? So our work in cocoa looks a lot at like nutrition and education outcomes for children. The logic there being that if children get a good education, and if parents can feed their families on the farming income, they're more likely to continue to farm. It's logic that's not quite complete, But it's the logic that we're working with in those supply chains. I think to your point on regulations, where it becomes super tricky is the validation of that data and how that data is used once we pass it to companies, right? Because we could pass to companies a report that we feel 100% confident in, and that report could go to a marketing team, and all of a sudden it's not, as researchers, we know language matters, right? And you change a couple words and all of a sudden the statement isn't true anymore. So I think it's being really careful with what you're putting in and trying to kind of maintain that connection with the corporate teams to be able to ensure that like everybody stays out of trouble, right? Because there are a lot of cases now where consumer groups have sued companies because of sustainability claims. My personal favorite one, if I'm allowed a little anecdote, is Hershey was sued because they said their cocoa was 100% sustainable. However, they also only have visibility into 40% of their supply chain. And like, I can just see the conversation between the marketer and the researcher, right? The marketer's like, so we're 100% sustainable. And the researcher's like, yeah, for the parts of the supply chain that we can see. And the marketer's like, great, we're sustainable. So I think those type of things and like consumer kind of pressure, right? And stakeholder pressure to move towards these outcomes is really muddying the waters when it comes to measurement of all these things. I think one last thing is that the really interesting part about work in supply chains is that supply chains are super overlapping. We work a lot in ag. There's a lot of people that are sourcing from the same farmers. We work a lot in garment, and there's a lot of companies that are sourcing from the same factories. And right now, there's a lot of individual companies trying to impact change on their own. And really what we need is more cross-sectoral work, right? Where we can get a bunch of companies to come together and say, look, we're all sourcing from this district in Cote d'Ivoire, or we're all sourcing from these 4 factories in Vietnam. Can we bundle our funds to have a greater impact? And I think selfishly, as a researcher, the benefit of that is hopefully more money to do the research, because I think we can probably, anyone that works in this area can agree, is that people don't value data at the cost that it takes to deliver it. We're constantly getting pushback for how come it costs this much money to do this. It's like, do you realize we're sending individual people out to talk to people? It's a long chain, right? At the current moment until we can close like the digital divide. And so I think the financial aspect of it also can't be overlooked, the value and really continuing to show what that value is back to companies so they appreciate the investment that they're making.
Yeah. Oh gosh, so much to unpack there. And I'm just trying to, so we definitely face that very much, right? Like in terms of the cost. In fact, so much of what we're doing in the initial weeks of the design work of the measurement plan, right, is really around right sizing it to the resources available. But resources are not just money. It's like you said, Kaitlin, it's that person actually has to go out in the field and collect the data directly, right? So what does that take, and how do you make sure everyone's safe in that scenario? And if you are using digital tools, who is the owner of the mobile phone, right? Like just as simple as is the woman, does she even have access to the mobile phone? Because in a lot of areas, it's a shared resource and it's the man who keeps it, right? So very much agree with everything you're saying. And even this point on attribution and contribution, right? Especially as now our sector and measurement is evolving, and what we're seeing is that there's a lot of conversation around, okay, we want to understand what's the changes in the system, and how can you run attribution exercises at the system level, right? And the is that even possible? What are the costs around that? And so when you talked about overlapping supply chains, we're trying to talk to funders where we're saying, hey, do you really need attribution, or can we use other techniques, other tools that can give you a pretty good answer of what is the change you're creating? But yes, there are contribution analysis tools, right? Whether it's the technique of contribution analysis, it's outcome harvesting, it's most significant change, or it's just storytelling, Carmen, like you're saying, with hard numbers behind it, right? And so what I want to share is that even with the ROI calculation, right, you would think that, oh, that's a hard number. And yes, it has all these benefits for companies because it helps them actually understand under the hood what kind of data they need to collect, what kind of management systems, again, just going back to that earlier point, they need to have in place. Because once they understand that an ROI requires really granular level data, they realize what are the costs involved in collecting that data, right? And then cleaning that data and then running the ROI numbers. I think, and I want to bring it back to Carmen's point about your blueprint needs to have qualitative and storytelling data, because those tell you the real stories. And it's actually what we're finding is that it's the stories that connect, right? It brings that emotional value. And nobody's saying that we don't want quant data. You need it, especially like you're referring to, Kaitlin, for the regulations and for the audits, and especially as you move into different parts of the world, right? And especially now if people are suing companies. So, but I'll tell you one quick story is that, when we came out with the ROI numbers for the company in Ethiopia and the company in Uganda, what we found was that there was pushback from women rights organizations and feminist researchers saying, wow, you're using the same system of finance that marginalizes people and puts people in a corner, right? How are you putting numbers on women's agency, on women's decision making, on women's ability to choose what they want to do for their family? And I think that feedback is rightfully so, right? And so we of course use financial proxies for that, but and we agree that it has to come with storytelling. Collect as many stories as the resources allow that tell you, okay, were women able to make that choice? Do they have that voice in their household, right? And I think it also goes to show that sometimes, like I'll tell you the example with the Uganda company with the daycare center. It was just assumed, you have a daycare, the women will become more productive, and then they will it was an agribusiness, so they will sort more seed and they will earn more income. But what if that's not what the women want? They want more leisure time, right? So I think it goes back to the importance of both qualitative research as well as quantitative research, as well as having really difficult conversations with your companies, with your funders about, does this have to be attribution? Can this be a contribution as well? So I want to, on that note, just return back to you, Carmen. Is any comments on any of the pushbacks that you have seen, or if you could share more about how your organization, how Pro Mujer is integrating qualitative research and bringing any of your investors or funders along for the ride and convincing them that this is valuable and necessary?
Yes, basically, as you were stating, we need both. We need qualitative research and we need storytelling. Why? Because we believe at Pro Mujer that data, it tells you what is happening, but the stories will tell you why it matters. Why it matters, what you are providing, it matters why. And that is basically what a story will bring you in. So that is why we deliberately make an effort to integrate qualitative research and storytelling into both our program design and the impact measurement strategies. So in both cases, we need to be very well aware that we will need both things. We work closely with the women in the communities. We are out there. We work very close to those communities we serve, and we basically interview those women. We also we establish focus group. We basically try to digitalize storytelling to understand their life experience. So these insights help us not only to tailor our solutions, to basically design new programs, design new products, design new services more effectively, but also to basically surface systemic barriers that quantitative data alone often cannot capture. So that is key for us. That is, for us, is not just anecdotal, but it's evidence grounded on the context we are working in. So to convince funders of the rigor of our methodology, we frame storytelling and qualitative method of basically to complement tools, to mix methods approach, to incorporate both in how we are measuring. So we standardize our qualitative tools. We are always training our local teams. We are always giving them access to the needed tools, to the needed support to basically come up with that important data, with that important information. So our local teams are trained in ethical and also consistent data collection, because they are the ones collecting the data out there, and they triangulate these findings with quantitative results. So when funders see how we work, they end up understanding women's personal journeys, and basically they get to understand what is the type of service that we are providing and that is generating an impact. We don't just, and as it was stated before, we don't just report numbers because we want to check the box. We report numbers also to amplify the voices of those women, to amplify the impact we are generating, to increase and to basically bring in more partners to understand and work with us, because they end up understanding the needs out there. So it's not only being rigorous, it's not only bringing in the stories, it's not only bringing in the data. This means creating a meaningful and sustainable information change, because the need is very big. Basically, we need more organizations working with us. We need more strategic partners, and to bring those and to design new programs and to design new services, we need to base in information. We need to base on the stories. We need to base on the full understanding on what's going on at the community level.
Yeah, I think for me, Carmen, that answer, like two of the things that really stood out. I mean, everything stood out, but two that really, like, it's almost you can see a bulb go up on my head. Is, the first one that you said is systemic barriers often cannot be captured by quantitative data, right? And that's the goal of organizations like Pro Mujer, right, is that we are trying to break down those systemic barriers for women through co-creating with women organizations, or sorry, with communities, etc. So that one stood out. And then I think the other one that really stood out is that the conversations that you're having with your funders are seeped in data and information. They're not these vague stories or, oh, look at this future that we can create for you, and like just kind of paint a picture. And it's important to paint a picture, but you are supporting that with like data, right? Hard data, And I think sometimes in the business world, it's qualitative data is called soft data, but it's that combination of data and information that is driving those conversations with funders. So I love that. Those two really stood out for me. Kaitlin, over to you. Just going back to that original point of any pushback that you have seen, and also how the companies you work with, organizations, and Care of Cause is using qualitative research and storytelling.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, especially because so much of, from like a CSR and a corporate philanthropy perspective, so much of the work that the measurement we were doing was qualitative, right? It was all stories. And so actually, part of the push, I think we've shifted all the way to the other end, where all people want is numbers. And I think we can all agree the happy medium is like somewhere in the middle, right? So we don't just want to produce anecdotal stories, because we really want to understand what's happening at scale, and it's impossible to talk qualitatively to every single person that participates in programs. But at the same time, I completely agree with Carmen that qualitative research is necessary to really like tell the story of the impact that's happening. Because you can say, this program improved the lives of 84% of the women that participated in it, but the qualitative is what's going to tell you what that actually means to improve a life. So I think that's super important. And the other piece around qualitative research that I feel like I have big opinions on is that I think it's really difficult to do quantitative research without having some type of qualitative base, because the reality is the answer options are structured. And so you're only measuring what you're only measuring what your own assumptions are about what impacts or outcomes may be, right? And I've been stuck in a situation many times where the other group of a response option is way too high, way higher than we want it to be. And everyone forgot to add a specify. So we're like, oh, we got this wrong, right? And of course we got it wrong, because these people's lives are completely different than our own context. And so if you don't start with some good information about that context and understanding of what people are going through, your quantitative work can end up being, no, useless is a strong word, right? But can end up being not as useful as you want it to be, because you just didn't kind of guess the answers right. So I think I'm a huge advocate. I'm a huge qual again advocate, which is an expensive approach, but I think the best one.
Yeah, and I agree. It's an expensive approach, but there are new technological tools. I think Heather was telling me about a new organization she met just recently about where they're using WhatsApp for data collection, right? And yes, it requires a first smartphone, but we're seeing smartphone penetration to become quite high. And then WhatsApp is much easier than sending an SMS survey, because a lot of SMSs are seen as spam, right? So just like the devil is really in the details. That's, I think, what we're trying to say also to the folks on the call, is that, we think about, selection bias, but we have to also think about our own research bias and the biases that we come with. And that's why I think I keep going back to Carmen's point about it has to be done with the community design, and not just programmatic design, but even measurement design is what we've learned, is that it has to be done with the program teams, with the implementation teams. If you have the resources to design with the communities, with the women that you are going to capture measurement, yes, it has to be done. In fact, we did this session yesterday around participatory research, where you include the people that you're going to study, in quotes, you're including them in that, and you're actually giving the data back to them, right? And that's in fact what connected you and me, Kaitlin, is like, that's the piece, that's the missing piece that research really needs to solve for. So, we're 10 minutes out. Please feel free, everyone, to put your Q&A. As you can see, we've been talking about some very hard truths over here, and so please don't hold back on your questions. We're happy to take some hard questions. We've had some come on the side, so I'd love to read these out to you. And I think first one is for you, Carmen. For smaller organizations or startups with limited resources, what are some of the cost-effective ways to implement robust measurement for social impact?
Yeah, and that is also a very good question, because in some cases smaller organizations will actually state that they are very small, they don't have the resources, so they cannot measure, and that is not true. At Pro Mujer, we often support smaller organizations and partners in Latin America who are doing a powerful work with limited resources. One of the first things that I always encourage them to do is to start simple. And you should start simple and being very strategic. So you don't need a very complex system. You don't need a very complex methodology, but you need to be effective. So you need clarity, again, on your objective. You need clarity on what you want to measure and why you want to measure that. So focus on a few key indicators, and Kaitlin is she knows better than me, but in some cases, you don't need more than 3, 5 indicators. The thing is, which are those key indicators that will allow you to show your impact, that will be aligned with your theory of change, as you were stating, and basically will allow you to basically bring in the outcomes that truly reflect your impact. So that is what you need. And use, of course, digital tools. We have digital tools out there. Many of those digital tools are even for free, or they have a very low cost. Try to identify which one is better for you. Try to use them. Collect and manage your data from the very beginning. Don't wait until the last moment. We have seen great results basically using mobile surveys, even WhatsApp interviews. So it doesn't have to be complex. You can use even community-led data collection. So you can go to community, identify those leaders that can help you in collecting that data. So think out of the box and try to use all your stakeholders, as you were stating also in your example before, Yaquta, where you engage everybody to collect that data. Most important, leverage those partners and try to collect with universities. In some cases, you have fellowship programs that can help you, local researchers, other NGOs that are working at the community level that can even share the tools they are using, can even share those frameworks that they are using or how they are evaluating. So be using all your network will help us if you don't have all the needed resources.
Yeah, I love that response. Yesterday I'm a big Formula One fan. So there was an event that was being held between Udemy and McLaren, and it was also focused on data. And even organizations that have lots of resources, Carmen, you hit the nail on the head. The first principles are the same, right? Across large resource organizations or small startups, right? Is what do you want to collect? Identify your goal, identify your objective, and start simple and start clearly align what you need to collect with those goals. I love that. Yeah. Kaitlin, anything to add there?
I don't think so. I think Carmen nailed it.
Okay, great. Awesome. So I did get a question on the side here is, what have you seen works to put power back into women's hands as it relates to the data they provide so as to empower women with data instead of just being extractive, right? So Can we pay for the data? Do we share the results back with benchmarking? Can you give us some examples that actually manage the power dynamics between researcher and respondent?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think first and foremost, personally, I feel very passionately about compensating people for their time. I think especially in some of these communities, like where we work in supply chain communities, right? If you source, you don't even know who you source to as a farmer, usually, like the brand that it ends up with, right? You know your co-op. But if you're sourcing to Mars and Hershey and Mondelez, and there's someone coming to knock on your door every month to take 2 hours of your time to ask you questions that you feel like you just answered, it's completely unreasonable to expect people to do that without some type of compensation. So personally, I feel incredibly passionately about that. In terms of presenting information back to communities, I think that's also an incredibly important part of this. I think a lot of times, like that's where the extractive model like really hits, is we're collecting all this information. Respondents have no idea what's happening with it. I formerly worked for Ipsos, which is primarily a research company. We did a lot of work on the Syria crisis. And a lot of what we saw was people being like, there are people asking us questions all the time. I'm still not getting any money into my, UN accounts. When is this going to change? Can you actually help me with any of this? And that was like a really difficult situation, right? That we were put in as researchers, because not being part of the broader organization, we didn't really have that control. I think now in a role at CARE, we do have more control to say, no, it's really important that the community understands. And I think in an agricultural development context, a lot of what happens, or what's happening in cocoa, is you work with the community to develop a community development plan, which prioritizes the community's interests for investment. And then they kind of see how it works, right? They see they're being heard. They see that they're getting help with the things, ideally, with the things that they need help with. And it's also the most impactful way to have results, right? Because school attendance could be down because no one likes the teachers, or because there's not enough room, or because social norms, people don't want to send their kids to school. We don't know. And if you only work on one of those and you don't take the time to figure out why it's happening, you can get really frustrated really easily by spending years and years trying to change something when in fact the assumption that you worked under was completely wrong. So to me, that kind of like all fits together into the importance of long-term community engagement as a part of research, and not just like kind of one-off time points.
Yeah, no, very, very well said. Carmen, anything to add over there?
No, I couldn't agree more. You have to engage the community. That is key. And that is part of the success, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, that is really part of that sustainable presence, right? And acceptance by the community, by the elders, by the leaders in the space, in the community, I mean, and by the women, and then also the men in those households too, right? We haven't even started to scratch that dynamic. Okay, so we have a number of questions actually in the Q&A have popped up. If we don't get to you, we will try to respond by email. But I think just really quickly, Kaitlin, there's now a standard for social impact measurement, SA 8000. Have you encountered this?
I'm muted. I was saying no, but I'm going to look it up right now.
Yeah, same here. We have not seen it either, Kristen, but thank you for raising it. That's really helpful. Maybe this one might be a quick answer, Carmen, is what are some of your organization's common indicators or indices for measuring women's empowerment?
Well, basically, we have various indicators, but for example, as we are supporting women through our skillings and programs, educational programs, we are always seeking to relate those programs and how those programs can increase sales, how they can improve their living conditions, how they can actually get more access to the market. So it depends the program, it depends the indicators, but basically that is what we are measuring, the real impact we are generating in them.
Yeah, that's our approach to Carmen, is that our theory of change drives the indicator selection. So we're at time. This has been such an amazing conversation. I hope everyone online has enjoyed it as much as I have had, speaking and moderating and facilitating it and hearing just these incredible insights from both Carmen and Kaitlin. Thank you so much for spending time with us. And yeah. And to our speakers, of course, the biggest thank you.
Thank you. This is great.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you. Great, Kaitlin. See you. Bye-bye.
Bye.